How's it going, everybody, and welcome to episode 148 of Master My Garden podcast. Now, this week's episode, I'm very excited about. I've been trying to line it up, or we've been trying to line it up for about 6 months. We've had a few dates in the diary, and then we had to change. And I'm delighted this week to be joined by Lexi Scott, who on Instagram has BW Gardens. And I suppose what makes Lexi stand out, we've been friends over the last couple of years on Instagram. And her garden is beautiful, very different to what we would see here. It's about an hour outside of New York City. It's a rolling site with lots of mature trees, really big boulders, for want of a better word. And Lexi is managing to garden very, very successfully in that environment. So what she really focuses on, she grows a lot of flowers, but what she really focuses on is growing her own food and taking that food from her garden into her kitchen. And then what makes her stand out for me, and what we're going to center the episode on, is how she preserves and, I suppose, adds value to that produce coming in and creates lots of different recipes, stores them in really interesting ways. And that's something that's interesting to me, because 9 times out of 10 I grow my vegetables and I either have to eat them before they go off, or I try or attempt to freeze them or something, and that goes wrong. So, Lexi, I'm delighted to have you on the podcast eventually, and you're very welcome to the Master My Garden podcast.
Oh, thank you for such a wonderful, warm welcome, John. It's awesome to finally connect. I totally agree.
Yeah, we've been I suppose, online friends, let's say, for a couple of years, and I can't remember exactly how we initially connected, but your garden is really interesting in that, as I said, it's an hour outside New York, but it's really set in a sort of a rolling landscape. Lots of big boulders, but you're utilizing no-dig gardening particularly, and you seem to be having great success there. So tell us a little bit about your garden. Now, I know you're in the middle of, possibly moving house over the next few months, so you're going to have to start all over again. But tell us about your garden as it is today.
Yeah. So we're based in the Hudson Valley. It's, as you said, it's an hour north of New York City, and the Hudson Valley is known for its ledge. So, we built this property from scratch, and we actually had to drill and blast into this site. So our landscape is full of, beautiful stone walls, and I was dealt a blank slate when we came here. So I knew I wanted to grow my own vegetables. Cooking has always been a passion of mine for the last 10 plus years. And I've lived in major cities, and I've always wanted to be able to grow produce, at a large scale. So that was, that's what we've basically been working on the last 6 years. You mentioned us moving. So yes, that is something that we're in the process of. I'm looking at being able to grow and store my food on a larger scale. I definitely have a very no-dig permaculture approach. So in terms of how we developed all of my spaces, it's a lot of bringing in, making my own compost, and then layering on, stuff from the land. So when we mow the lawn, we use our grass clippings. I make my own compost. I make my own biochar. And yeah, do you utilize no dig yourself, right? In your garden?
Yeah, in all of the food growing beds, yeah. Some of my own compost, although not at all, because I need to get a wood chipper, because I'm still finding that the compost that I make myself, while very good and definitely enriches the soil, it's a little bit woody still.
Yep.
So need to get a wood chipper for that. I'm sure for your setting, because you have a lot of mature trees around you, you're getting a lot of leaf mold, I expect, are you?
Yes, we have lots of leaf mold. So particularly this time of year, I'm mowing the lawn, and not only am I getting grass clippings, but I'm getting a ton of maple leaves and oak leaves, etc., which is awesome. Brilliant. So I can get my beds prepped, for the winter. I let the majority of them rest. I do garden a lot of, leafy greens and things like that. And I have row covers that I put over that and keep them going as long as I can. But yeah, going back to the wood chips, all of our flower gardens, when we set this place up, we had, as you can imagine, lots of trees taken down. So we had mounds and mounds and mounds of wood chips. And a lot of them I let just sit for 2 to 3 years.
Right.
And they turned into the most amazing, amazing stuff to put down into the ground. So what we did with a lot of the back gardens that we developed, particularly for the pollinators, is we, because of all these amazing rocks we have, we laid out all these rocks and then we put sheet mulching. So cardboard, laid that down, sometimes like wool blankets, anything that can decompose. And then we brought in these amazing decomposed wood chips, layered them on top, put a layer of compost, and then spread all of our, it's a combination of annual and perennial seeds. And then from there, mulched it with a combination of the cuttings, grass or leaves, etc. So that's just kind of an insight into that kind of permaculture style approach that I take to developing a new site.
Yeah, and how was, so you when you were initially building the house, you had to blast into stone. So have you got a layer of topsoil there naturally or not?
No.
Wow.
No, when we moved in, there was nothing on the ground. So it was all of these beautiful retaining walls based all around our property, but then it was just like, the fill that they put down into the ground.
Yeah.
So that's what we looked at to start. Then they came in and they put topsoil down. And then from the topsoil, grass seed, and then the straw mulch. And that's basically how we started all of the grounds. And then from there, it's just been a process of developing each of the spaces. We have in the back of the gardens, we have, like I said, these pollinator gardens. And in the front, we have a couple of different interesting gardens. We have, my husband is English. And so based on the sort of British influence, we have a bunch of roses. We have climbers. We have little bush roses. Definitely an ode to lavender, echinacea, sage, lots of edible herbs, lots of different bulbs and things that we try and focus on these gardens being really so all of the 4 seasons, there's something that's going on, through them. And then in front of them, we have more of these wildflower gardens to compensate for the pollinators.
Brilliant. Yeah. So you have a lot going on. Your vegetable garden then. Oh, actually, sorry, one more thing before you move. You said you're making your own biochar. So you have you're digging a hole in the ground essentially and burning. What type of wood are you using?
Well, so I'm doing biochar in a couple of different ways. One of the wood stoves we have is an insert, which is a high efficiency wood stove. And so when we burn wood in there, which is a combination of oak or maple or birch, when that finishes its process in the chamber, we're actually left with all of those little hard, lumpy chunks of biochar. And I'm able to ground that down and then sprinkle that into the garden. And then the other way that I'm making it is I've actually dug a pit out in where we have our fireplace, and I layer different organic materials. It could be from sticks. It could be from, pieces of 2x4. It could be, thin pieces of wood, etc. And then I layer them, and then I light the fire on the top so that the fire burns down slowly to the bottom. And then I just blast that with a garden hose, and I'm left with the charred organic material. Yeah.
Brilliant. And you're applying that to all your vegetable growing beds then?
Yes, I wasn't to start because I didn't really know about it. And then I read about it, I think like 2 years ago. And I was like, I couldn't believe just the benefits of biochar. Yeah. And I remember listening to a podcast you did yourself about biochar after I had applied it. And I remember standing there in the garden thinking, this is brilliant, because the person you're interviewing, all the benefits he was describing you can have, I had been noticing.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons I actually pursued biochar so passionately was because it's being linked to combat jumping worm damage.
Yeah, I was going to actually mention that. Yeah, because
that's a whole
we've never heard
kettle of worms.
Yeah, we've never heard. Well, I had never heard of jumping worms until you mentioned it after that podcast that I did, and you said that there was some, I suppose, research showing that it combated jumping worms, and I thought this was really interesting. So how has that gone, and has biochar helped with your problem with jumping worms?
It definitely has. So there are ongoing studies. The problem with jumping worms, they're asexual. They are non-native to North America. They are from Asia. There are no predators, and it's the fact that they can just, duplicate on their own.
Okay, yeah.
And they overwinter, no problem. Their eggs overwinter. So there's no sort of known way to actually get rid of them, and they spread at an alarming rate. And what they do to your soil is they actually break it down so it looks almost like a coffee ground-like structure.
Wow.
So it makes it super hard for it to retain water. And, you know, erosion is more likely to take place, and it depletes, because they're living at the soil surface and they're eating that leaf mulch and all that litter, they're depleting the nutrients that are available at the top that your plant's roots are looking for.
Yeah.
And, you know, earthworms traditionally live below. So where they're breaking stuff down and their poop and all that good stuff is happening, and your roots are going down deep into the soil and they're getting all that goodness, the jumping worms are just ruining that whole process.
Right.
So that's why finding solutions, because like my entire property, they're all over the place. So I you know, there's studies that say if you apply mustard powder and, you know, make it into a liquid, you can get rid of them. But when they're there, they're there. Like,
yeah.
So it's a matter of figuring out how to live with them, which is why I went down this biochar route. So anyway, so I did some testing 2 years ago, and I left some beds completely alone and did my normal prep of wood chips and grass cuttings and compost and leaf litter and all that stuff. And then the other beds, I added biochar in with all of that.
Okay.
And the difference, that coffee ground like structure that I was constantly coming upon, it was there, but it was very, very minimal. And then the following year, it was almost non-existent. So they're still in my garden, but the rate that so what these studies are showing is that it's actually, it's slowing them down, because it's not allowing them to produce or maybe have babies or at the same rate that they're allowed to when the biochar is not in the ground. So,
okay. And so they're still present in those beds, but the damage that they're doing is being reduced because of biochar.
Correct. Absolutely.
That's brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the fact that there's no natural predators and that there's nothing known to kill them makes it very, very difficult. But something as simple as biochar over a 2-year cycle seems to have improved. Yeah, that's brilliant. Now we don't have them here, so it's thankfully we don't have them here, but it's really interesting to hear that biochar is effective for that. Because I have heard some theories on biochar being useful for vine weevil, which, if it's true, would be hugely beneficial across all gardens around the world. Again, I don't know if there's any truth in that, but I know that there's people looking at that currently, and it might stand to reason a little bit. If it's working for something like jumping worms, then potentially it could work for, you know, for vine weevil, and if it did, it would be brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I mentioned that obviously the crops that you grow, we might ask in a minute what those are, that you are brilliant at bringing that through to your kitchen, and that's going to be, I know, potentially down the line there may be cookbooks in the future and so on. But tell us about what you're growing, and then, you know, how that comes through to the kitchen, and then we're going to start talking about what really caught my eye a few months ago was I have on probably 3 or 4 occasions now tried various ways of freezing green beans, and and it has been unsuccessful every time. So I've put them straight into the freezer. That doesn't work, as I'm sure you know. I've tried parboiling them and then putting them in the bag, and they came out not nice either. And I've tried it in a few different ways, and I've had no success with it. So that's one personally I'm very interested in, because every year you get these gluts occasionally of things like peas or French beans, and it's a shame then when you're not able to save them in the right way. So we might delve into that. But tell us about what you're growing actually in terms of crops first.
Well, I grow a lot of different things. I think the first couple of years here, I wasn't focused so much on preserving per se, but more growing really interesting different food and cooking really cool meals with it. I've always been really passionate about growing tomatoes. Even when we lived in Brooklyn and I just had a stoop, I had tomatoes. I had like 10 tomato plants
Brilliant.
up and down that I bring in and cook with. So tomatoes have always been a passion of mine. And like actually this year we grew 80 tomato plants, which was quite the thing because we had a super hardcore drought.
Yeah.
and there was a lot of watering and but what was really interesting living through this drought is I had zero blight. I didn't have any fungal issues. I had, all of the plants, I just let them grow on their own, go a little bit nuts. I didn't really prune suckers. I know that's a big thing. A lot of people say you have to remove your suckers. I kind of let everybody just do their thing. And they were some of the healthiest plants I've ever had and produced absolute bushels of fruits.
Yeah,
So,
on tomatoes, like, well, I grew way too many as well, 40 something plants and I don't need that many, but I still have them out there. I'm still getting tomatoes off them. But I'm still on the pruning part, a bit like what you said, like the pruning of them, from the base up and taking off the side shoots and all that really has come from commercial growing, where if you're in a glass house for commercial growing, you want to keep the environment as clean as possible because it's generally large scale disease buildup and so on. And also then you have the element of too much side shoots blocking out light maybe, and some fruit not ripening as quick as they could. But I'm still not convinced in a garden setting that there is any massive benefit in the pruning that we all seem to currently do. And I've tried it a few ways myself. I've tried it a little bit this year on a couple of varieties where I'm doing the usual thing. As the fruit trusses form at the base, I'm taking off the flowers the leaves directly below them, and as it moves up along, I'm doing that the whole way. And at the end of the season, you're ending up with a sort of bare plant at the base, and then all your growth up top. And it's successful, but I like exactly what you said. I don't think it's any more successful than letting them just grow, to be honest. So I'm wondering if for a gardener, all the faffing about of pruning and all that is actually that beneficial. And I think it's the jury's out on that for me.
Well, I think it depends on the climate that you're in. And, like I said, we had a really dry, hot summer, and they just seem to thrive in that. And, I was only I was hand watering at the base. So there was no splashback. There wasn't spores flying all over the place. So I think when you're in like really humid conditions, it's a different scenario. And that pruning of the lower leaves, like, because I know when I've had really wet summers, that pruning really, I think, does make a difference. But in terms of removing the suckers themselves, when, a lot of people will say you have to do it, I think they're great to remove to root and get a whole new plant.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I get a really lovely free plant. That's great. But it all depends on your own garden and your own microclimate and your own situation. I just know that I was really pleased to see just these plants turn into almost like these little mini trees, just covered in fruits, and so happy. So
good. Sorry, I interrupted you there, and we've gone off on a tangent. So tomatoes.
So I grow a lot of beans. I grew some really interesting beans this year, a variety called succotash. It's indigenous to the Northeast, and it's got a really cool story relating to Native Americans and potentially being at the first Thanksgiving, and being served in like a succotash dish with corn. It's just beautiful purple. I loved growing that variety this year. I grow a lot of pole beans, bush beans. I love bush beans. They're super easy for like dilly beans. That's a canning way that I love. That's just, I find those are quick pickles that I love doing like that. So you just put your beans into, you wash them, put them into a ball jar and make your pickling brine, pour it on top, put the lid on, pop it in your fridge, and you're done. I love really easy pickling things like that.
And your pickling brine, so what are you using for your pickling brine? So everyone uses something different, but what's your secret recipe?
So my go-to is I love juniper berries, cinnamon sticks, bay leaves, black peppercorns, salt, honey, and coriander seeds. That's really my sort of go-to blend that I love to use.
And are you using a vinegar, a type of vinegar? No?
Oh, yes. And apple cider vinegar.
Apple cider. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And okay, nice. Yeah, that sounds good.
I sometimes use white vinegar, and I actually did white vinegar a couple of times this summer. I shared some recipes. It's a lot stronger. Apple cider vinegar is more sweet. It's just not as, it just depends on what you like. I mean, some people like really strong pickles, like especially pickles, right? But I think I prefer on a whole, definitely apple cider vinegar.
Okay, brilliant. And in terms of what vegetables you're pickling, so that's one I hadn't actually seen before, pickling beans straight off the plant. So
Yep.
what else are you pickling? So here we pickle beetroot, some onions. I don't grow cucumbers, but I would pickle
Yeah.
cucumbers. Obviously, that's an obvious one. What other ones do you pickle?
I love to pickle okra.
Yeah.
I think that, that's definitely, okra has mucilage. It's a substance that's released outside of an okra. So when you pickle it, it's like this slimy sort of gel-like substance. And that's actually what thickens gumbos. And that's traditionally why okra is in like a gumbo soup.
Okay.
Because it thickens it up. But yeah, I love the way okra tastes. I'm trying to think, what else do I pickle? Oh, I like pickled carrots. Have you ever had pickled carrots? Those are really good.
No, that sounds good.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I haven't tried that.
Yeah, I like to peel them and then slice them.
Nice.
Tomatoes. Have you had pickled tomatoes, cherry tomatoes?
No. Well, this is good. This is good. That's a recipe ideas.
Yeah, I'm working on right now. I've done a couple of variations. I haven't found one that I like enough to share, but a pickled cherry tomato ketchup that I've been sort of toying around with anchovies, and there's a little bit of anchovies in it, and honey, a little bit of mustard. So hopefully I'll be finalizing that soon.
And pickled tomatoes, pickled cherry tomatoes. How are you going about that? Just same process, same
process, exactly. So just making my brine, packing my jar, clean sterilized jar, and packing it up with the tomatoes, and then putting a lid on it.
Wow.
When you water bath can, you can do similar things in terms of pickling with water bath canning, which is, being stable for your shelf. But you really have to you have to follow a recipe that's basically been signed off. So you don't end up with any type of, botulism or bacteria or whatever forming. Yeah. So that's one reason why, because I'm such an experimental, and I do a lot of small batch canning. That's my other thing.
Yeah.
So I'm about to actually embark. I've frozen the majority of my tomatoes that I've preserved this year. And once I'm done doing all of this pickling things I'm talking about, or dehydrating or fermenting, this is another thing I've just really ventured into new this fall. I'm going to actually take all of the tomatoes from my freezer, and then I'm going to water bath can them, because my freezer is, I have it's like a standing shelf, or, where you open up the top, and that's full of tomatoes. So I also freeze bone broth and all sorts of other things, like we've been talking about with beans, etc. So I need room. So I'm going to actually take all those out, and then I'm going to follow, a ball jar, or just, an approved, recipe, a shelf stabilizing recipe, and get those in there. So I haven't really ventured loads into water bath canning, primarily because I'm doing a lot of these small batch things and they're experimental. So that's one reason why I like to pickle them, because I can just pop them in my fridge and eat them as I'm going along. And then by the time I've eaten that, I've probably harvested something else, and I'm into a new, you know what I mean? Like a recipe I'm creating and going there.
Yeah, well, it's funny over here, because you're talking about small batch canning and bell jar or something for a shelf. But in Ireland, funnily enough, we're really, really poor at the execution from having too much vegetables to small batch canning of, like, I don't even know what some of those terms mean. So maybe small batch canning, just
so it means so for example, like say I have 4 cucumbers ready, right?
Yeah.
So I've got enough to fill a quart or a half pint, or you don't have a lot. You have a small amount of vegetable, but you can't eat it that day. You were saying sometimes if you don't get to it, it ends up in your compost or whatever.
Yeah.
So instead of just it going off, you preserve it in just that one small little jar, and then you just put it into your fridge or even your freezer. You might just produce like a small little Ziploc bag, and then you would eat it as an individual meal, as opposed to spending an entire afternoon processing 30 jars of something that's going to end up onto your shelf, which is, if you're running a large scale homesteading operation, that's really how you're working. You know, you're going to devote like an entire day to a fully harvested situation of whether it's tomatoes or beans or whatever it is, and you're going to just knock it out and get it onto your shelf for your winter. That's going to feed your family. Where because I'm not growing at such a large scale, I am in these situations where I have these smaller little batches of food, but I want to be able to use it and not waste it. So that's why. So that's what small batch canning means to me.
Yeah, I think that's important. Like, and as I say, we're quite poor at it here. I don't know whether that's because, I don't know why that is actually. I probably have a few theories, but we definitely need to get better at it. And I personally need to get better at it. I know when I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that you were coming on, there was a lot of interest in this because people do have this, and it might be only small scale, like you said, four cucumbers that are ready, and you're not going to eat 4 cucumbers. So essentially what you're saying is you just pickle those in a jar. And that's saving those 4, and you come back to them at a later date. But the tomatoes is an interesting one, and I hadn't seen this before, or I did, but I didn't pay much attention to it. Was that you're taking tomatoes straight off the plant, putting them in a Ziploc bag, removing the excess air, and then you're just popping that in the freezer. Am I right in saying that?
Yes, that's it. So the other step that I do with that is I remove the core, because by doing that, when you take these tomatoes out of the freezer, the skins just naturally peel away easily for you. So you just run it under a little bit of warm water and the skin just falls straight off. And then you're using that for cooking your
tomato sauces and whatever.
Exactly. So prior to this year, I hadn't really had enough tomatoes to undergo, excuse me, this large scale sort of canning, water bath canning, shelf stabilizing thing that I'm talking about, where I'm going to hopefully have a lot of jars put on my shelf. So I would just pull a bag out at a time and make, a big vat of marinara, and we'd have a meal. Or I'd make a marinara and make, like a big batch of lasagna, and then freeze my lasagna portions that we could come back to, etc. But yeah, I mean, literally freezing tomatoes is the easiest way to preserve them. It's just, they last for months, many, many months. I mean, I have a bag I found the other day. It's at least a year old in there, and it's absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with it. So, I think especially when you are new to preserving, whether you're using a pressure canner or you're using a water bath method, it can seem quite intimidating because, there's just with the health concerns of making sure that you're doing it the correct way. So putting something into a freezer and just getting confident that you can save food that way is just such a great way.
Yeah, it makes sense,
gateway into it.
When you start going down the route of canning and jarring up food, you do need to be aware and careful of the process before you're sure that food is going to be good on the shelf for 6 months, a year, whatever. But I think even for us here, that basic step of being able to freeze something directly from the plant, like that's a good step and a really sensible step to start. The French beans one, just purely out of personal interest here. You had a story during the summer, and I'm sure I can dip back into it to find it, but the proper way, so that I don't get it wrong next year, the proper way to store French beans. And I know there was a few little steps to it, but it was very simple.
Yeah. So I have found, I've, like you were saying with beans, I've not parboiled beans, I've parboiled beans, and I kind of stumbled upon this little trick by accident when I had left some vegetables out in the hot sun and I had to revive it. And I put everything into an ice bath. So I took my fresh produce and I put it into an ice bath, and it completely revitalized it. So it's soaked in basically a bowl of ice water. So lots of, half full of ice cubes, half water, and it completely revitalized it to this fresh, really crisp vegetable. And with my beans, I said, okay, I'm going to do this. So I tossed all my beans in there. Then I parboiled them for 90 seconds. And then I laid them on a cookie sheet, and so they're not touching each other, put them into the freezer. And then froze them. So, this takes I think an hour, maybe 2 hours.
Yeah.
And then you pop them into a freezer bag, and that way they don't stick together. So
Oh,
when you
brilliant.
go, so this, excuse me, ties into small batch canning. So if your beans aren't ready, you can have your big Ziploc bag and you can fill it a quarter of the way full. And then when your next round is ready, you do this same step and you just add them into that bag until your bag is full. And then you've got
Brilliant.
your free. So then through the winter, you're just taking it out. So that way you don't, maybe you were going to have enough of it ready at once. So you're going to be filling all of these bags to go into your freezer. But if you're not, that's an option for you to just freeze as you're going along. You can do that with anything from, green peppers to okra to, anything you want to freeze, you can do that step. Some things you don't need to, like a green pepper, for example, if I was doing that, I wouldn't parboil it. I would just slice it up, wash it. I might put it in my ice bath. I might not. And then freeze it individually on the tray and then put it into a bag so they don't stick together. So depending on what it is you're freezing, you might want the ice bath, but yeah, freezing individually first is super because they don't stick together and you can just take out the portion that you need.
Yeah, that's really clever, and it makes perfect sense actually. But I hadn't thought of it or seen it until you had it in your story there a few months ago, and I'd forgotten about it until you mentioned it there now. But yeah, that freezing individually is brilliant because that is one of the things they stick together, and then when they stick together, I don't know, they take from one another within the bag, and then when you go to cook them, they're not the same. So that's brilliant. And essentially then you could do that with peas, I guess.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I do that with peas. You could do it with, individual kernels of corn, just flick them off of, or even just take your knife and run it down the side.
Yeah.
And then spread your corn out onto the sheet and do it the same way.
Super. You mentioned dehydrating as well and fermenting. Fermenting, I don't think we'll even go there because it's a whole other
it is.
Episode,
and honestly, I'm a newbie and I don't want to claim I've fermented 2 jars. So
dehydrating, what do you do? What foods are you dehydrating, and how do you go about it? Obviously you have an electric dehydrator, have you?
I don't. So I have 2 different ovens and I use one of them for dehydrating. So, I mean, if you're dehydrating like loads at a large scale, it makes sense to invest in a dehydrator. But in terms of like the powders that I've really gotten into, so tomato powder is a new one that I've gotten into this year. And so when I was talking before about when you're defrosting your tomatoes and those skins are coming off, save all those skins. And then you lay them out onto a parchment lined cooking sheet and then just put it in at 180 or 200 degrees into your oven. And it takes a couple of hours and they become completely dry. And then you just put it into a coffee grinder and you're left with tomato powder and it can just sit on your shelf. You can do the same thing with garlic skins or garlic, not the outside of the garlic, not the stuff you're peeling off, but the actual skin you can do that with. Yeah. You can do that with chilies. So you could do the same thing with sweet peppers or chili peppers. Something I've gotten into this year, I showed a reel recently about a watermelon fruit roll-up. Yeah. So you can dehydrate fruit, whether it's pineapple or watermelon or strawberries. That's super fun to do. And so you could just, what prompted me to get into this is I've been looking for a snack, like when we're out on the bikes or on a walk. It's just something that's like super healthy and easy. I can just take out and like munch on when we're, out and about.
Yeah. Brilliant. So well, you've covered a good bit there. Something else that we've mentioned and we've spoke about previously is moon gardening. And I know, and we won't go into it in a big way. And I've sort of mentioned it on the podcast before. And I know before we started recording, you said that you hadn't sort of followed it too much this year. But just from your experience, how did I think 2 years ago you followed it, quite well, and how did you notice? What advantages did you see? Was there any difference between this year where you didn't and last year where you did practice?
Well, it's really interesting you're asking me that because last year I had amazing carrots, amazing parsnips, amazing onions. Trying to think what else in that world. And this year I couldn't get any of them. Well, no, I had one bed of turnips that was good. And I actually knew I was sowing them in the good mood phase.
Right.
And my turnips did okay. I actually still have quite a few out there. But I mean, carrots, I think I grew 4 carrots. And last year I had beds of just amazing carrots. I had a freezer full of them. I was pickling them. But essentially during there's 4 sort of moon phases, and the way that the water tides are moving with the gravity as the moon is going around the earth is, half of the year, the water levels are going down, and the water tables are going as gravity's pulling, everything down into the earth. And that's when you're planting your root vegetables, your vegetables. So your seeds are being pulled and they're just being encouraged to go deep down into the earth, and vice versa. When the water levels are rising, so your above ground fruiting vegetables, your tomatoes, your annual flowers, those types of things, is when you're planting those plants.
Yes. And you have noticed the difference now, I suppose.
Well, I didn't follow really for my root vegetables, for example. I can't tell you exactly, but I know that last year I followed to the T, when I should be planting, because there's proper calendars you can buy, and it says like, based on, on the 22nd of this month, do your parsnip. And I would like, okay, I'm putting my parsnip on that day based on, the water levels were at the strongest with the pull and all the stuff. And I just had amazing root vegetables, and this year they were terrible. Now, could it be because we had a drought? Yes,
Possibly,
it could totally be, there's lots of things, but I was interesting that I noticed, and like my onions, I can't even tell you how many onions, and they did terribly. So, I think there's something to that. I need to the thing is you got to do it, like you have to sort of do this and be able to record really, similar data to really back it up.
Yeah, to really back it up. And I've read a couple of books on it, so I'm a little bit familiar with the the concept and all that. But something that really catches my interest or piques my interest in it years ago. So I'm in my 40s now, but when I was like 10, 12, 15, I live on a farm, but I also used to do some summer work on a farm. And at that time, and this is going to sound really strange, but I think there is something in the moon phase for farmers as well. So at that time, if there was a particular job, and the job was generally castrating young bulls, if that had to be done, I know this is a gardening podcast, I don't know why we're talking about this, but certain farmers would not do it during a certain moon phase. And and I saw at that time that if they did it during what was supposed to be the correct moon phase, there was no issues afterwards. And when they did it in the phase that wasn't, there was definitely a marked difference. And so the point I'm trying to make is that I don't quite know what exactly determines or causes these little changes and these little differences, but I do think that there is 100% something in the moon phases that affects humans, that affects plant life, and that affects animal life. As I say, I'm not quite sure of exactly the intricacies of how or why it happens, but I think there's definitely something there.
Yeah, I totally agree. And one of the endeavors that I hope to pursue is to, really, biodynamics, Rudolf Steiner, that's like a really good, if you're really interested in that, and that really talks about that the symbiotic relationship with earth and animals and life and the solar system and how everything works together. So that's something that I definitely want to continue to dive deeper in. And I don't think that I'm a subject expert to speak on it now. I know that I've seen that there's certainly something to it, and I just want to keep pursuing it because I agree with you. There's absolutely something to that.
Yeah, there is. There's a connection, and it is. Definitely there is something deep there that is working. Yeah, I'd like to understand it more myself. We've kind of talked about a lot of things.
Yeah.
I suppose you're probably getting excited to potentially be starting a new garden over the next year or so.
Yeah.
I don't know. Have you plans in your head yet, or have you plans drawn out yet for what this new garden is going to look like, or is that still a bit too far down the line?
Yes and no, because we have to, like, we know where we'd ideally like to set up this next operation. And if we go to where we want, then yes, I definitely have. There's just so many things that I do different. Like when we started here, like, permaculture gardening and regenerative gardening and really working with like my piece of land was not on my radar. Like I remember I got some raised bed built and they put in topsoil. That was it. And I planted some garlic bulbs in there. And now I look back and I'm like, oh my God, just topsoil. That's crazy. That's not even really alive. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So to have the ability to influence it from day one is exciting.
Correct. Yeah, based on, what's there and where we're going. Potentially there's going to be a lot of pine trees, which means that the soil is probably going to be a lot more acidic than what I've been used to dealing with here, because I'm primarily dealing with maples and oaks and, those types of plants. So there's just certain things I'd be thinking about. But one thing that I've really gotten into is incorporating clover into our lawn for just like wildlife, just leaving my plants that I'm planting alone, because that's what they want to eat. That's like a native plant that they just want to get into, like our woodchucks and rabbits and things like that. But also in my garden, at the beginning of this year, I scattered clover all over my garden walkways, and to act as, not only a cover crop to help with erosion and just soil health and everything, but I'm mowing as the clover is growing, I mow it down, and then I just take all of that goodness and I just dump it straight into my bed. Okay. So what I think I would do in my new space is actually just plant a huge big area of clover and then work my beds around this huge big space. So that's kind of something different I would do.
Yeah, so chop and drop directly onto your beds, feeding the soil.
Yeah, but what's like right there next to it.
Yeah, sounds really interesting. I know, as I said earlier, your Instagram and I often look at your stories when you're cooking. You do pizzas and
yes,
different hot pots, or not sure what you guys call them, but stews, hot pots, whatever you want to call them. And they always look phenomenal. And cookbooks, as you mentioned, may be on the agenda down the future, so that'd be really great if they were. Tell us where people can find you and can check out some of these recipes, and where online. Obviously, Instagram is your main port of call, so maybe direct people to that.
Yeah, so my Instagram handle is BW Gardens, or at BW Gardens on Instagram, and that's primarily where I live right now. I have a page on Facebook, but my main sort of hub is Instagram. I do have a website, which I'm just in the process of developing and really launching, dedicated recipes and sections to, I think the one thing I'm really passionate about in terms of the kitchen is a Sunday roast. And my, passion really grew when I was living in the UK about that, is that, having that celebration where your family comes together one day a week. I mean, I don't know if you guys do still
for sure,
embrace. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And from that whatever you have, made on that Sunday, that kind of sculpts your week. So like whether you're having like a pot pie, or, maybe you've had roasted chicken and then you're going to have like a buffalo chicken pizza on Tuesday because you've got leftover chicken. So really utilizing like that roast, it can be turned into all sorts of different phenomenal meals throughout your week. So that's definitely around a lot of how I cook, because we do a Sunday roast. Obviously in the summer, it's a bit different. We may not do a lot of like the real big meat heavy pieces. We might do fish, but that can still sculpt what we're doing throughout the week. Yeah. So that's kind of along the ways of where I'm envisioning some of these books going in the future.
Excellent. So yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, the Sunday roast and family around the table, that is a big thing here. And yeah, obviously a big thing in the UK. So it's, and yeah, you're right. I'd like my girls to sort of agree more, but they don't. I would eat, if we had something, I would eat for the whole week. Whereas within my house, the girls will eat it on the day, but then the next day, no. So I need
Right,
to change that.
you could turn some of your leftover chicken into some beautiful chicken nuggets, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Some homemade fresh chicken nuggets. You could have some, I'm sure you've got lovely Irish potatoes in your garden, some
Yeah,
French
sure,
fries, and I'm sure they'd love that.
Yeah.
So, you know,
yeah, yeah. So when the cookbook comes out, I'll definitely, hopefully, move them across to utilizing it over the whole week.
yes.
Lexi, it's been a real pleasure. As I said, we've been trying to link this up for a long time. We've been friends for a while, but it's been a real pleasure. There's so much more we could have talked about, so we might end up doing this again sometime in the future.
Yeah.
When moon gardening takes centerfold with you and you've done a few trials and so on, we might come back to something like that. But for now,
Absolutely.
Lexi, it's been a real pleasure, and thank you very, very much for coming on Master My Garden podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, John. Take care.
So that's been this week's episode. A huge thanks to Lexi for coming on. Yeah, as I said, and you should definitely check out her page, BW Gardens. In terms of storing food and in terms of cooking, you'll love her page. So really worth checking out. And I know when I mentioned a couple of weeks ago on the podcast that we were going to do an episode that was centered on, preserving and utilizing these gluts of crops, or these, crops that we have at the end of the season. There was a lot of interest in that. And I do think that, particularly here in Ireland, we're not very good at that process of saving and being able to utilize it further down the line, freezing, canning, pickling, all that sort of thing. Some of that comes from the fact that we're very, very generous as a people. So when we have a lot left over, we always deliver it out to our neighbors and our family. Whereas in reality, we should be maybe keep a little bit more of it for ourselves and saving it for the future. But definitely check out Lexi's page. It's BW Gardens on Instagram. And yeah, that's been this week's episode. Thanks for listening. And until the next time, happy gardening.